Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, whenever you may be watching this. I'm Dr. Manu Platt from Georgia Tech Emory, and I'm glad to welcome you all again to another one of our Amplified Race and Reality in STEM webinars. So Amplified Race and Reality in STEM aims to give a national platform to speakers to have candid conversations around race and diversity in the STEM field. It was launched this year as part of Gladstone's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this series is hosted in partnership with Georgia Tech, shout out, the Molecular Engineering and Sciences Institute at University of Washington, and the University of Texas at Austin. We really hope these discussions spark change throughout the sciences. Please follow the conversation using the hashtag #AmplifiedSTEM. And now I would love to take this great privilege to introduce our speaker. Dr. Courtney Cogburn is currently an associate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work and faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center and Data Science Institute, where she co-chairs with the Computational Social Science Working Group. Some of you didn't know those words go together, and she's going to really show us how they do, and I love that. She employs a transdisciplinary research strategy to improve the characterization and measurement of racism, and in examining the role of racism in the production of racial inequalities or inequities in health. Fascinating topic. Dr. Cogurn's work also explores the potential of media and technology in creating and eradicating racism and racial inequities in health. Love that. She's the lead creator of the 1,000 Cut Journey, an immersive virtual reality experience of racism that premiered at the 2018 Tribeca Film Festival. Again, she's crossing all the fields. She's also the co-founder of the Justice, Equity, and Technology Laboratory. And to give you an idea of her background training, Dr. Coburn, she completed postdoctoral training at Harvard University in the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar Program and at the Institute for Social Research at University of Michigan. She earned her PhD in Education and Psychology and a Master's in Social Work from the University of Michigan and her BA in Psychology from the University of Virginia. So thanks to all that's watching. Turn it over to you, Dr. Coburn. Looking forward to this.
Great. Hello, everyone. I can't see you, but I'm happy to be here with you, and really just delighted that more and more people are, I guess, joining the conversation and joining the work around racism and anti-racism, and hope that some of my work can be insightful for your thinking and how you decide to continue moving forward. So as Manu said, my background is a mixture of things, both in terms of formal training in education and psychology and social work and population health, but also in terms of just the way that I practice and approach research. I think about, I describe myself as a transdisciplinary scholar, so I think a lot about how different disciplinary perspectives, both in terms of theory and methodological approaches, can be integrated to address really complicated problems. And the problems I focus on are grounded in issues of racism. So in my conversation with your planning team, it seemed that it might be helpful to give briefly just some background on the connections between racism and health, the established literature, which will also give you some insights into where my work fits in and how I am attempting to help move this body of work forward. In general, when we think about racial disparities in health, we're thinking about differences in health on the basis of race, and really kind of leaving it there. And I'll unpack the use of the language disparities in just a moment. When we think about Black-white differences in a variety of physical health outcomes in particular, we really see evidence that for the 15 leading causes of death, we see disparities between Black people and white people across those 15 diseases, including heart disease, cancer, stroke, etc. And what we find when we say that disparity is not just the presence of the disease, but the onset, the progression of disease, and mortality as a result of these diseases. Black people suffer from each of these issues much sooner, with a faster progression of disease and higher mortality risk as a result of each of these diseases in comparison to white people. That is striking in and of itself. It's a persistent finding. It's one that has been difficult to explain. It's one that has been difficult to move the needle on. It's pretty stubborn and persistent across these different health outcomes. But what's especially striking is that these differences persist even when we account for socioeconomic factors like education, income, healthcare access, healthcare quality. So we still see these differences by race, even when we account for the factors that would most obviously explain the differences in health. It's also clear that racial disparities, racial differences in health persist at every level of socioeconomic status. So even for higher income, higher educated Black people, these patterns hold. In fact, we see some health outcomes that get worse for Black people as their education and income increase, such as sleep quality, maternal health outcomes, etc. So this leaves us with some tricky questions. Why does race matter for health? If it's not the ways in which socioeconomic factors are confounded with race that are explaining these differences, why do we still see differences by race even when we account for those socioeconomic factors? I think it's important to note, certainly my position and the position of many others, is that race in and of itself is not meaningful. It does not cause or influence anything. We made race up. We created it as a social construct. And so the things that we observe by race are inevitably grounded in something social or something contextual that's important for us to understand and unpack. One of my mentors who recently passed away used to say that if the patterns that we observe in terms of the disease are just a matter of being Black and checking that box, then we can all just start checking different boxes and those problems would go away. That's nonsensical. It's not just the box that we check, it's the experiences that come along with that box that are important for us to unpack and understand. And in fact, if we stay in the area of difference, if we stay in the space of this group is different than that group and just sort of leave it at that, I and others would actually call that a racist practice. And in fact, some would call that a bio-racist frame, that we are suggesting that there's something biological or essential in a racial group that's contributing to their relative advantage or disadvantage as it relates to patterns of disease. So why does race matter for health? Because of racism. And so let's unpack what that means. So this would argue that we observe these differences by race. There's nothing inherent about race that would explain the patterns that we observe in disease, both for Black people or white people, let's say. So what else is it? Why do we continue to see these residual effects by race? What are the social, cultural, structural systems that might be coming to bear on these patterns that we observe? Racism. Because of this, we think about racism as being a fundamental cause of health inequities, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So one, we think about racism as being a driver of phenomena that contribute to the patterns of disease. We think about racism as being a root cause. So racism can shape practice and research in ways that produce our understanding and framing of health issues and health inequalities. It can change the ways in which we sample and the way we measure particular health phenomena that can contribute to the patterns that we observe. And certainly that racism contributes to a host of socioeconomic factors that have direct relationships with patterns of disease and various health outcomes. So that these socioeconomic factors don't function and exist outside of some understanding of structural racism that help produce the patterns of socioeconomic factors. So patterns of education, patterns of income, patterns of healthcare are all grounded in structural factors that are also grounded in racial inequities. So that's why we're thinking about racism as a root cause. We also have evidence that exposure and experience with racism contribute to both chronic and acute physiological stress processes that can contribute to poor health outcomes down the line, physiological and other types of stress response processes that contribute to poor health down the line. So the argument that racism is a fundamental cause is really grounded in, if you don't deal with racism and the reasons why we're observing differences in the more proximal factors, you may not be very successful in doing anything about racial inequities in health. So let me highlight the distinction between disparities and inequities. I've been using those terms not interchangeably, but it often is used in this way. So when we think about health disparities, we're thinking about differences in mental health or other health outcome indices in terms of prevalence, access, and quality of care that persist even after we account for other known correlates that shape mental health and other health outcomes. when we're thinking about health inequities, we're really grounding a language in some belief that those observed differences by category are tied to structural injustice. So we're thinking about the ways in which structural racism and other forms of racism are actually contributing to the patterns that we're observing. We're not assuming that there's something inherent about being Black or something inherent about being white that's particularly informative in telling us why we're observing these patterns in population health. We're thinking about the systems and structures that have helped produce those patterns, and that those are injustices, that those differences shouldn't exist or wouldn't exist if it were not for these situational factors. So that's an overview of racial disparities, racial inequities in health. And so my work really falls into three different buckets. So one, thinking about the ways in which we characterize racism. The second is thinking about ways to measure racism, especially in modern contexts. And the third bucket is the ways in which we might engage racism as a social problem, a social issue to be challenged. I'll give you one example from each of these buckets to give you a sense of how I'm moving this work forward. Before I go into this, I'll just note that most of the work on racism and health have conceptually framed racism as being individual in nature and structural in nature and cultural in nature. But when it comes to measuring racism, we've tended to only measure racism as an individual experience. So maltreatment on the basis of race, being mistreated by a healthcare provider or being mistreated on the basis of race in life more broadly, that then has implications for health down the line. It's a very broad, robust literature that has established a strong foundation for the significance of racialized experiences in contributing to health, but it has also very narrowly focused on one manifestation of racism. And in terms of measurement, we haven't thought very carefully about these other ways in which racism manifests. So my work is attempting to do that. My work is attempting to further develop the ways in which we characterize what racism is and the ways in which we measure it. So as I've said, racism is multidimensional. We're thinking about this not only in terms of individual and interpersonal manifestations, where we're thinking about discrimination, I've been treated badly, implicit bias or prejudice. We're also thinking about racism as structural and institutional in nature. So we're thinking about policies, laws, and practices that produce patterns in systems. That's a completely different problem than we're all just a little bit biased, right? So we want to think about this in terms of structures and institutions as well. My work is particularly focused on cultural racism. So I think a lot about language and imagery and symbols and rhetoric in ways in which messaging around racism manifest. So in particular, there's this movement in population health in general to really think about social determinants of health. And there are a lot of references to culture in that context. So in Healthy People 2020, there's this framing of an aggregate of social and cultural institutions, norms, patterns, beliefs, and processes that influence the life of an individual or community. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is forwarding this movement around the culture of health, which they frame as shared national priority for health for all, which includes creating healthier, more equitable communities. But there's some major gaps in this space. So one, culture is being under conceptualized. What does that even mean? What do we mean by that? And that we're often in this body of literature focusing on race without focusing on racism. So again, race is not particularly useful if we don't take the next step to unpack why we're observing those racial differences. So there's a failure to integrate this rich literature around racism and what that means and how we represent it into this broader conversation about culture and health. Even within the racism literature, where people have spent a lot of time thinking about culture, cultural processes, and cultural structures, are really thinking about are thinking about culture as systems and thinking about cultural threats to health. But even in this body of work, we don't actually measure that. We have a tendency, again, to focus on individual experiences as opposed to cultural phenomena. And so there's more work that needs to be done to integrate this. So the paper that I highlighted at the beginning is a conceptual offering that integrates multiple disciplinary perspectives of people thinking and talking about culture and what that means to try and represent this in a more substantive way. So I would frame cultural racism as intersecting systems that frame and shape collective narratives and ideologies that are composed of complex language, imagery, symbols grounded in presumptions of white superiority. So I know I'm skimming over a lot of this in hope that it sort of just sets up discussion in our Q&A, but to sort of wrap that portion up, when we're thinking about cultural racism, what I'm arguing is that we have to think about culture not only as practices that are embodied in groups of people, but that phenomenon, that it manifests in terms of phenomenon at a societal level. It shapes our shared collective understanding of race and racism and inequality and how we think all of these things work. And this has implications for health, what we do about health, how we approach health research, how we approach health policy down the line. I also argue, and I'll show you an empirical example of this in just a moment, where exposure to these narratives, exposure to these symbols and imagery are also a direct threat to health. They produce these sort of biological and physiological stress responses, potentially, that can have consequences for health over time. So this is this cultural framing. Racism is multidimensional. I'm specifically focused on cultural racism. How do you measure that? That's real nice and cute to say racism is all these other things too, but how do you actually go about measuring that? I started during my postdoctoral training thinking about this in terms of media. So if I'm saying that racism manifests in our language and in our symbols and in our imagery, media is a good place to go to start thinking about exposure to cultural racism in this form, or racism in that form. And I was particularly interested in acute physiological, emotional, and behavioral stress responses in as a consequence of being exposed to this sort of cultural racism through media. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of what we're finding. So I conducted a laboratory-based experiment where I exposed people to, and they were randomly assigned to neutral media content, very blatant racial content, blatant being someone in blackface or someone using the N-word, or they were randomly assigned to a condition where they were exposed to relatively subtle content. So references to race and racism, but indirectly. An example of that I like to use is Paul Ryan blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. This is a headline in an interview that he was giving. So Paul Ryan in this instance is blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. He's implying Black people, he's implying Black men. He's not using the word race. He is also in a coded way referencing someone else in the same interview that suggests that Blacks are genetically inferior. So Paul Ryan doesn't say this. He's sort of producing this complex pattern and use of language to more subtly convey this. So in a laboratory setting, I'm interested in what that does to people when they're exposed to that type of content. So in a sample of 18 to 25-year-old Black and white young adults, the patterns that we observe is that for Black people in the blatant condition, when we're thinking about physiological functioning, we looked at this in several different ways. I won't go into detail, but in particular, heart rate variability. Black people, when they're exposed to the blatant content, say someone in blackface, they actually regulate their heart rate pretty well in response to this content. So they notice it, they're consuming it, they're considering it, but they're not stressed out by it. We see the opposite pattern for Black people assigned to the subtle condition, where the language and imagery are more coded and more indirect. We see with heart rate variability, for instance, that Black people became highly dysregulated in their ability to regulate their heart rate when they're consuming that more subtle content. We actually observe a very different pattern for white people in these conditions. So white people in the blatant condition, for instance, were highly dysregulated, similar to the ways in which Black people were in the subtle condition. But when they were exposed to when white people were exposed to the more subtle content, it was almost as if they weren't picking up that they were being exposed to anything particularly troubling or concerning or worth in-depth consideration. So in this work, it was an initial attempt to say, we consume this type of media all the time when we're exposed to our Twitter feeds and Facebooks and those sorts of things. What does it mean when you sort of casually come by this sort of information? What does that do to one's body? How do people react to this when they're consuming this content? And again, this study is much more complex than I have time to go into, but it's just to give you an example of how I attempted to start measuring exposure to cultural racism, particularly in the form of media. So what are we thinking about in terms of engaging racism? So an example of this for me has been my work in virtual reality. So thinking about the ways in which we might leverage immersive virtual reality to help people engage racism and what that means and how it actually manifests in society. In particular, asking whether an immersive virtual experience of racism can improve one's understanding and engagement of the realities of racism. And this is really grounded in this belief that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism, that we understand the problem, and not just an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption and production of science and data, but one that is a visceral understanding, that's emotional, that can connect to spirit and body as much as reason. And so can I use virtual reality in this way that helps people connect and engage in a deeper, more meaningful way? So I conducted this work in collaboration with my colleague, Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford University, who'd been working in VR for over 20 years. I have a background thinking about and studying racism. Jeremy's thinking about social and behavioral applications of VR. We joined teams to think about how we might build this kind of work together. Just quickly, this was a transdisciplinary process. We tried to think about what disciplinary perspectives do we need to help us pull this off. And this team actually ended up traversing psychology and social work and computer science, involved creative technologists, artists, and designers to all come together to try and solve this problem as a collective. Where we landed was an immersive experience where you become a character named Michael Sterling as a child and adolescent and as an adult, where you're experiencing racism in different forms at each of these ages and in different contexts over time, to give you a sense of, if you occupy the digital shoes of a Black male, might you start to have a sense of what racism looks like from that perspective and how it's experienced from that point of view. Not that if you were not a Black man, you would never understand what it means to be a Black man living, say, in the United States. This is not the purpose of this. This is an intention to let you see things from a point of view that you wouldn't normally be able to occupy. In the first scene, you're in a classroom, you're on the floor playing with blocks with some of your peers who are taunting you and end up saying, Mike, throw this fireball, throw the scary Black fireball. Black is always the scariest. So we're trying to introduce in this space not only how early these types of experiences emerge, but that even with white children often being reared in colorblind socialization contexts and not thinking about race, and we don't see color, are still picking up racialized language and racist language that they may be using in ways that they don't understand, but they're using it nonetheless. We goad you essentially into throwing one of these blocks. People usually throw the block at that kid on the right, on my right, who's saying, you throw the scary Black fireball. And that triggers a white female teacher who's not pictured in this screenshot, who yells at you and chastises you for being dangerous and you're going to hurt someone, even though the other kids are also throwing blocks. So what's important, I won't go into this level of detail for each scene, but what's important to kind of connect with here is we didn't just make this up. We didn't just create a story. We actually drew this from an empirical literature on the school to prison pipeline, disciplinary practices on the basis of race, particularly for Black boys beginning in preschool. And we recreated the ways in which that could show up in a classroom setting and can be problematic, not only in terms of the act itself, but the consequences for the child having these kinds of experiences. We use mirrors quite a bit, so we want you to see the body that you're occupying. We want you to connect with the movements of this body. So we have you look in a mirror as you transition to an older version of yourself, where you're in your New York City home with your parents. You can walk around your bedroom. You have in this scene an encounter with the police later on your way to a basketball game, where the police yell at you and tell you to get down on your knees and put your hands up. And we want you, the user, to get down on your knees and put your hands up. So there's various ways throughout this experience that we're trying to layer both subtle, blatant experiences with racism, again, that are occurring across different contexts in slightly different ways, to give people a sense of the variety in which racism can manifest and show up. In the final scene, you're in a workplace setting, and we wanted to create a situation where you feel invisible and disregarded and undervalued. In this scene, the interviewer who's to my right approaches the white candidate who's waiting and says, "You must be our candidate from Yale. I'm so excited to meet you." He's quickly corrected by the receptionist that you, Michael, are the candidate from Yale. And it's the first time that the interviewer turns to acknowledge your presence at all. And as he does that, he says, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. You don't mind if I take him back first, do you?" At the end of this scene, you get a voicemail saying that you're an excellent candidate, but not a good cultural fit for the organization. Again, none of these are exaggerations. All of what we've created is empirically based and also based on personal narratives and anecdotes that have been shared with us at each of these phases of life. So I wanted to give you a sense of what this looks like in terms of, this was the first mock-up of the classroom that you're in, and what the use of the mirror looks like in terms of the user. This is Tobin Asher, who's part of the Stanford team, what that looks like in terms of how synchronous the movements can be. And then I'll just show you a trailer from the experience.
Mike, look at me!
Leave that boy alone!
Black is always the scariest.
He didn't do anything wrong!
I know what that
Black fireball, Mike. Make
You
this
can't leave here dressed like that.
is. It's us against
Being
them.
dangerous? I shouldn't have to tell you not to throw
Sorry,
things
didn't
in
notice you
class.
there.
Just brush it off.
You have now become Mike Sterling. Look at yourself in the mirror.
So again, in this experience, we were attempting to bring together a web of representations of racism. I started talking about how we conceptualize racism. It's not just direct experiences with maltreatment, it's cultural, it's in the air, it surrounds us, it's structural. So the effort here was to try and integrate a lot of that, a lot of those different types of representations into a single piece. Again, I'm attempting to describe something that's meant to be experienced in virtual reality, and very quickly at that, but hopefully it gives you some sense of how we're approaching some of this. When we were at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018, we opted to leave our space blank and gave people Black markers to write on the walls as they came out of the headset. And they were saying things like, "You think you know how something feels until you experience it," "eye-opening," "can't stop thinking about this project," "harrowing, powerful out-of-body experience," "the inability to choose or change Michael's fate," hit home. So this was my first indication as a complete novice prior to starting this project, and in terms of virtual reality, this was my first indication that we were hitting a spot that was meaningful and useful. And it was important for me for this to be informative and not entertainment. And so that was a balance that I was trying to strike as we developed this work. Again, I'm also a social scientist, so as is Jeremy, he's also a psychologist. And so we're very interested in what effect do we have on people when they go through these sorts of experiences. And so we've run several empirical studies that I wasn't able to share with you today because we're in the process of analyzing the data. But to try and get a sense of before and after using experimental design with different conditions, longitudinal studies, qualitative and quantitative studies, trying to get a sense of what effect are we having on people when they go through an experience like this. We've integrated it into the classroom in various ways. Again, we're interested in helping shape people's understanding about this. And just lastly, we're in the process of designing our new experience. We're in post-production on the VR narrative component. We've switched to using motion capture, but we're also interested in data visualization in VR. So what I'm working on now is trying to visualize structural racism. Again, I'm trying to help people understand systems and structures in a way that will better support our ability to support policies that are intended to address systems and structures. If we think about racism as bias, we'll attempt to fix bias with unconscious bias trainings and that sort of thing. If we think about racism as also being structural and cultural, that will require different solutions, and perhaps solutions that will be more effective than intervening on every individual, say, in an organization. So we're playing around with the ability to use zip code which we know is quite powerful in predicting mortality risk and educational and employment outcomes, and visualizing that in VR. We're also playing around with the ability to manipulate time. So see a physical environment, a digital environment shift and change over time based on policy decisions that have been made. How might a stop and frisk practice introduced in New York City, for instance, as time progresses, affect different bodies standing on the street in different ways? The people who are more likely to be stopped might, in particular increments dictated by the data, start to decrease in color saturation and eventually become outlines that represent incarceration rates or being jailed. So we're trying to be creative and innovative in how we translate real data into visualizations in VR that become meaningful and impactful. And again, this is all grounded in a social psychological literature around when people understand structures and systems, they make informed choices about what types of policies and social interventions make most sense. And the more that we can get people to understand structures and systems, the better off we'll be in terms of moving toward things like racial equity and health. So thank you. I look forward to our conversation and hope we still have plenty of time.
Thank you, Courtney. All right, here we go. We have a few questions come in, and more hopefully will start coming in from the audience. I am going to take a poetic license as the moderator to ask my question first. Wow, okay, so the VR experience, quite fascinating. And I love that you're using that as a tool, and now you're going to expand it even for structural racism. I mean, wow, congratulations. So there's two things to it. So the name triggered me, and I couldn't think of, I was thinking, wait, which one was that? Which one was that? Then I think it was maybe an amalgamation of two, but it still was just a trigger for me that I don't know if that was the point. But my question is longer term impact. Like as we're in this moment now, I think a lot of people I talk to are like, oh, everybody cares right now and they want to change things, but what will happen later? I'm curious, in your VR experience, have you been able to test participants a year out, 2 years out, and if they still have the same attitude they had right after they had the experience?
No, we're working with a couple of organizations to try and implement that kind of study. You need people to be very stable within an organization to pull that off, as opposed to say a community sample that you're trying to hunt down and find, you know, even weeks later is a challenge. But what we have done with a sample of graduate students here at Columbia, we gave them a battery of measures before they came to campus their first year, before they started the program. Then they got to campus, they were randomly assigned to complete the VR experience or not. And then they completed that same battery of measures again. Those students then took a class about anti-racism, anti-Black racism in particular, that I helped design. And then 14 weeks later, they completed that same battery of measures. So we're able to see before the VR, after the VR, controlling for condition, and then looking at effects over time. And what we're seeing so far is really fascinating, that people who have been assigned to the VR condition in 10 minutes are getting to the same place that students in the class are getting after 14 weeks, which is just really striking. And this is just for one measure in particular called system justification, which is a measure of how comfortable are you with the status quo, as opposed to how aware are you about structural barriers and the ways in which structures contribute to social inequality generally. And again, this is social work students. These are people who are already probably leaning in this direction anyway. And it's been, you know, that we're already seeing evidence that the VR can be quite powerful very quickly. It's not a replacement for a 14-week course. It's not a magic pill, but it is giving us some insight into, we can help people frame this and understand this in a way that can be really beneficial. That course may take on new meaning once you understand how structures and systems work, as opposed to thinking about racism as being about interpersonal relationships, for instance.
That's interesting. We have some requests actually that if you offer this as a workshop, that people could take it their home or their home institutions or home workplaces. So do you, I don't know, take it on the road, or are you up for training at different environments?
We have, and you know, this is kind of created since the film festival. That wasn't the intention. When we started off, the intention was, oh, let's see if we can do this. Like, you know, in typical academic kind of fashion, like this could be interesting. I don't know what might come of it. But because we premiered this at the film festival, it put us on this very public stage. And then, you know, people and companies were just coming out of the woodwork saying, can you do it? Can you do a training? And it wasn't designed for that purpose. But I would say since 2018, I've gotten at least 2 or 3 messages a week from people still asking to use this. So my capacity to do that is limited. That's not actually my job, but we have done it. We have worked with large corporations. We've worked at large events where, you know, hundreds of people go through the VR experience and have the capacity to set that up. I tend to work with senior leadership in organizations, so C-suite or other strategic leaders throughout an organization. Again, what I think the piece is helpful in doing is help people frame and understand what racism is. And too often with our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, we skip that part. We think, yeah, racism's bad, let's do something about it. But in what other context would you attempt to solve a problem that you can barely characterize or describe? You're not going to be very effective in whatever solutions you try to launch on the other side of that. So we do work with organizations, but we're not a diversity firm and don't do this a lot. So we're pretty selective in you know, who we're able to work with.
Well, I'm sure you're going to get a number of other requests after this workshop as well. So, you know, I'm sure you're ready for it. Okay. And I will say, I'm going to go to another question, but I did find it also poignant, I'd say, how you said there had to be a fine line between informative and education and entertainment, which that's a whole lot. But let me get to the question.
We could talk about that all day, Manu, in terms of, because I designed this experience for white liberals in particular. That is who I had in mind. And when I say that, people often ask me, well, aren't you preaching to the choir? And then I didn't do it today, but then I started using a picture of an all white choir in my talks. And I'm like, yes, I'm talking to you. This group has a lot of work to do. This is a group that's misaligned in terms of what they say their values are and their actions and behaviors. This is a group that tends to remove themselves as if they're somehow neutral in the fray of race and racism, and they just get to observe how awful that thing is over there, but don't accept any responsibility for their role and participation in those very same systems. And so that's why that's a target audience. But then what that means for Black people who put on the headset becomes something completely different. That's not who I intended this for. So trying to juggle that, we could talk about this. We did a whole study with just Black people, a qualitative study, to try and get a sense of what does it mean for a Black person to become a Black person in VR? And what is that?
I was going to ask if you use that as a control, but let me get back to some other questions, because again, I'll try to steal you later. Wow. Okay. So another question came up. Again, thank you for this important research, but in relation to the research in VR, I know you're not training everyone, you've made that clear, but have you worked with any healthcare providers in academic medicine so you can kind of try to address your VR research to address structural racism in healthcare training to kind of...
Yes. So that's like the perfect intersection for me, right? Racism and health, and then the VR comes in. And so we've worked with Northwell Health in the Hofstra School of Medicine. We're in conversation with multiple medical schools who are interested in integrating this. I'm on an advisory council for the American Medical Association, which is thinking about how to integrate this. So yes, and we actually have a paper in academic medicine that talks about that relationship with Northwell Health, about how they were attempting to use this to engage their senior medical staff there. So that might be a good reference for people who are interested in the medical context in particular.
That's fascinating. If you start to see outcomes, we'd love to see that.
Yeah.
So there's another question here about, are you measuring any biomarkers in response to the virtual reality experience? And if so, what have you found? Any biomarkers that are associated with a response to racism?
No, but I'm really interested in that. So the first time I got into psychophysiological work was during my postdoc. It's not my area of expertise, and I didn't use biomarker data in that study. But we were thinking about that as it relates to the VR, because I'm interested in how stress, indicators of stress are manifesting while people are going through this experience, and whether it looks different on the basis of race or other factors. But there was no one on my team who had that expertise, and we didn't want to, this was our first undertaking, so we didn't want to take that on in addition to everything else. But I'm really interested in doing that as well. And we were moving in that direction, both in terms of physiology and biomarkers, as COVID was hitting. And so those conversations sort of got stalled. But I'm definitely interested in working on that. If there are others who are in the audience who would be interested in that, I'm happy to have those conversations.
Shout out. She's Googleable. Another interesting question about the variability of white subjects. For example, Did you see any difference responses for whites who were raised in a multicultural setting versus those that weren't?
No, so we're just starting this work, and so we're not to the point where we can break down whiteness in quite that way. That's pretty complicated design-wise in terms of a research study. But what we are getting a sense of is variation by political ideology. We're in a position to do that. We're still analyzing the data, so I can't say that just yet, but we have our graduate student sample who are social workers coming into a social, school of social work, are 90% liberal to very liberal in terms of their self-identified political positioning. And then we have a community sample that's more diverse in terms of conservatism versus liberalism, but we're still in New York and we're pulling a sample primarily from New York City. So it's been difficult to get that variation, but our community sample will give us at least some point of comparison about white people who espouse different kind of types of political beliefs and how they might be responding differently to the experience.
So I gotta ask this question. You named your person Mike Sterling. Is there a Brianna Bland? And are you going to do this from the Black woman's experience and the Black girl to the Black woman? And so what do you think might be different in that experience that you would encode or you might measure?
Yeah, so there's so much wrapped up in that question. So one is the name Mike Sterling, which you mentioned before. And the crazy thing about that is I just picked that name randomly.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
I was doing an interview, one of the first interviews on this work. The piece hadn't even been finished yet. And the journalist said, okay, Michael Sterling, you combine the names of Michael Brown and Alton Sterling, right? And I lost my breath for a second because I hadn't realized it. I just kind of made this snap judgment, okay, Michael Sterling, and now we have to do this and now we have to do that. And it did not hit me until he asked me that question, which is just, anyway, there's a lot in that. Also,
it's in the back of your brain at all times, right?
It's there, right? It's shaping your subconscious. It's informing your thoughts in ways that are quite critical. But in terms of focusing on Black women, I absolutely want to. I don't necessarily want to create. I'm already on my second piece now that's intended to educate white people. And again, it's targeting a group where we have an empirical base that suggests they misunderstand the nature of racial inequality in our country, particularly in the United States. They underestimate racial inequality. They overestimate racial progress. I'm using these two pieces that I've been working on to intervene on that very particular psychological phenomena. If I did a piece on Black women, I wouldn't do the same thing. I wouldn't say, oh, this is what racism feels like when you're a Black woman. I think instead what I would do is again, work with a very transdisciplinary team to create a piece about, joy and beauty and strength that would be for Black women and not in service of, educating white people. And I say this, just to kind of really be very honest about the tension for me, because what I'm trying to represent in this virtual reality experience are things that are already very clear and very obvious, and people have written about it in novels and plays and rap songs and the news. It's everywhere, and there's still this resistance of accepting that this is where we live. We're in a slightly different place now post George Floyd, but I've spent most of my career trying to convince white people that racism matters and is an important thing for us to address, all of us. It's not like a separate social science thing to consider. It's everybody's problem to think about. So there's a tension for me having to spend time and resources creating a virtual reality experience to explain things that should already be very clear and obvious. And I'm just not interested in spending any more time doing that, but really leveraging the pieces that we've already created and then shifting my focus to imagining different futures and celebrating, joy and beauty.
I would be speechless after that answer, but I'm supposed to ask you some more questions.
Okay.
That was a great one. So in the space that you have created this for white people, you're getting several questions about, have you tried this with other ethnic groups? Have you tried this with police officers? But I'm also going to flip this into another question that came through, a question that another researcher gets from Sincere, that you could maybe put in your white label batch, sincere STEM researchers and professionals. How can we change the minds of old white men in STEM to embrace diversity initiatives and ideologies? Can the VR help? And can behavior psychology assist as a STEM education researcher to implement this mindset change? Can you hit older white men? Will the VR help make that difference? And are there other ideas you have in mind?
So I guess it would depend on the older white man, right? To whom are we speaking? In my experience with the VR, I've been pretty amazed at how white men in particular have responded. And this is not in our empirical studies. This is just anecdotally. We've run thousands of people through this at this point. Again, when I'm working with senior leadership, you can guess who's on those teams. So that's the data reference that I'm thinking of there. And that's the group that I expected to be most resistant. And they've surprised me. They've surprised me. I've had white men, partner at a law firm crying in the headset before he's even taken it off. I've seen white men with whom I've had interactions with prior to them going through the VR become much more thoughtful and reflective and open after they've gone through the VR. So again, this is not empirically based. This is just, my experiences. So I wouldn't discount it. Again, I don't think it's any sort of magic pill. And I think these are particular white men who put this on or who invited me, right? If you invite me, that says something about you. In terms of where you are in these conversations and your willingness to have these kinds of conversations, but then to put the headset on and go through the experience. So I think we're still dealing with a certain slice of white man, right, even in these experiences, but I've been surprised. And frankly, I think what's most important about the experience is what you do with people after they come out of the headset, right? It's the kinds of conversations and the unpacking and the reflection. And now let's look at patterns in our data. Now let's think about this news story. Now let's think about our DEI initiatives, right? After we've kind of created this sort of common ground. And when I started this, one of my goals was I had in my mind, when a Black man comes out of this, a Black person comes out of this, I want him to say, that's it exactly. Okay. And when a white person comes out of this, I want them to say, I thought I understood this, but I don't.
Huh.
And when you
that's actually another one of these questions of in your study with the Black people, did they say that the VR experience was similar to their actual experience of racism? So are you saying you want them to get that? Did they give you that as a response?
Yes, and it's complicated. So to this day, right? If for the Black people on this call, the feeling of doing something on behalf of Black people. You don't want to embarrass Black people, right? And you want to embarrass yourself in the process. And so there was a lot of pressure for me, like I can't mess this up. Like there's a lot on the line here. So when Black men come up to me and hug me and thank me for doing this, when the Black men on my team, helped carve and shape this, tell me that this feels authentic, that means so much to me. I think the tensions arise around what does this do to Black people who are going through it in a headset? There are triggering responses. Most Black men I know have had violent encounters with the police. So what does it mean to then encounter that in virtual reality in a very realistic way? What does that do to you? I've also had Black people tell me that it was therapeutic and validating, that they're grateful that now they don't have to share their personal painful stories of trauma to educate people, but can, push that off on the VR. Go through the VR. Don't ask me about my son, right? Just go do the VR. So I think there's some complexity there. There's criticisms from Black women around, is this racism porn? Are you yet again using the pain and trauma of Black people to educate white people? Why would you do that, right? So there's been a range of reactions that I think are important for us to keep being critical about and unpacking.
To be honest, when you said we're going to talk about this fine line between informative and entertaining, I did get to thinking about like Call of Duty and these other games, and then people want to upload it where you can kill like a white supremacist or something, and then if there are a different type who are like, oh, so it's interesting you've already received that critique. So
yeah.
But I understood about you don't want to make Black people mad. But I guess the question is, we asked you about old white men, but have you taken it the other way and tried to put children in this study? I mean, we know Dr. Ibram Kendi wrote Anti-Racist Baby to try to train young people. Do you think that children in your VR experience might be impressionable and have a moment with it?
So I think I am very cautious about using this kind of VR with children, and all of our studies focused on people who were 18 and up. At the film festival, I've had children go through it with their parents, their parents right there with them, and then their parents talking with them after they've gone through the experience. Immersive VR is a little bit tricky with kids under the age of 9, it seems, based on that empirical literature, where not only are they very impressionable in terms of what happens in the experience, but they can often have trouble delineating what was real and what wasn't, what actually happened and what different, and their memories can get a little bit confused about, no, I went to a baseball game, even though you went to a baseball game in VR, you remembering it in a particular way. We have a colleague who does work with Sesame Street around VR, and meeting Elmo in VR is way more impactful than meeting Elmo in person. In terms of behavior, like, do you eat your vegetables and do you brush your teeth? That's a good thing when you're telling people to brush their teeth and eat their vegetables. That's a whole nother thing when you're exposing them to racism. It's a whole nother thing when you're having them shoot guns, right? And so we don't understand that yet. So I've avoided it, but I do think there are probably some really meaningful ways to use this, especially in a classroom setting, especially with really skilled educators, teachers who can talk with their students and build a curriculum around, let's put this in the context, let's really unpack and think about this, not a download in your living room and go through an experience of racism and then walk away. And so I've been very cautious about, with whom do we share this experience? What do we expect to happen in concert with going through the experience? All that feels really important, especially with kids. And if I design something for kids, I'd probably make something very, very different.
Like you would provide something. It's so interesting. And I think it's great. I mean, you're well trained clearly, but it goes with your training for the social work, about this clearly socially responsible way of approaching these things, which, wow. So another question, the VR that you described seems effective at invoking empathy. Have you looked at superordinate goals too? Like, could incorporating the simulated accomplishment of superordinate goals be useful?
Could you repeat that? You were kind of going out a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. The VR described seems effective at invoking empathy. Have you looked at superordinate goals as well? And could incorporating the simulated accomplishment of superordinate goals be useful?
Possibly. I mean, I've thought about empathy, and I've also pushed against empathy. And again, because I'll deal with empathy first before I get to the superordinate part. Empathy to me is insufficient and not particularly interesting. And I'm not sure if it's actually possible in an experience like this. I'm not sure you could ever really understand what someone else feels like going through these kinds of experiences. And I'm not sure if you did that would translate into anything meaningful beyond you feeling bad. And so I'm less interested in people's emotions and feelings in response to the piece, and more interested in how they act and behave and think as a result of going through the piece. And so, I mean, that's related to the second part of the question, but like, how do we translate to something beyond empathy has been really important for me. And in our empirical work, we haven't focused on behavior so much, but we focused on analysis. So how do you analyze problems of race and racism differently as a result of going through this? We certainly measure bias and empathy as well, but I think those are stops along the road to where we're actually trying to get you to go. I think the notion of skills and goals in VR starts to get us into game entertainment territory. And not that this would ever be as entertaining as, like, a roller coaster game in VR. It's not entertainment in that way, but it's something to be solved and achieved as opposed to something to be understood. And people often kind of jump to this happens in DEI trainings or DEI initiatives more broadly, where we just had this conversation here at Columbia at an institute that we're running here, where people want to jump to the training. Just tell me what to do. Yeah, that's bad. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix it. You don't understand the problem yet, though. So, like, how am I building in these soft skills training and sort of teaching you like the yeses and the nos, or will you be able to translate it to anything outside of that particular band of prescribed behaviors or goals? And so I think, to me, training doesn't make sense until the container that you're pouring the training into has been fixed. And I think what we've been focused on is shaping and forming the container that anything else that comes after gets poured into.
Come on, I like that. We're starting to get close to the end game, but I did want to ask this one. Can you recommend an article that outlines the data showing that white people overestimate racial progress and underestimate racial disparities?
Yeah, so Jennifer Richardson, who's at Princeton, her lab, Michael Krause is another person who's also at Princeton. Sorry, they're at Yale. Their research lab has produced most of this work, particularly white people living in the US, and just people in the US in general, but it's particularly striking among white people. Their attitudes about mass incarceration, what types of policies they present, they support, how they can be resistant to data that gets introduced to try and explain, right? It's actually worse than you think it is, and that introduction of fact doesn't actually help at all. And so there's been work on, Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford has done some interesting work in this space as well. So I would go to any of their research labs. Richardson is Richeson. Start with her research. They've produced so much work about this. They're really the place to go to get an understanding about ideology and beliefs in terms of the empirical data. There's also some other more sociological work that's really important in this space as well. So Bonilla Silva has a book called Racism Without Racist, where he talks a lot about white ideology and mental gymnastics and color blindness, and how all of that contributes to these misframings and misunderstanding of racism, and what the sort of ideological roots of some of that might be. And Joe Fagan, Feagin, also has some interesting work around meaning making and framing. That's important to read as well.
This is fantastic. I just want to tell everyone watching that when on the YouTube video of interview had blurred images from the screen, those will be corrected on the YouTube, so you can make sure you can pick that up and see that. I know you have a hard stop. I thank you so much for your time. Would you like to give any closing thoughts to our audience as we wrap up?
No, I saw the comments about the font on the slides. I'm sorry, I've never had people have trouble with that before, but I'm sorry if it was too small for people to read. It should be clear
on the YouTube video, so that's
okay. That's good.
I wanted to thank you. I love the perspectives you brought. You can see, I think you've introduced your work to a large crowd, and thank you for your time. And
yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you all for, these conversations aren't easy. So I'm glad that you're joining the conversation.
All right, Dr. Courtney Cogburn.
Bye-bye.